It took exactly 47 seconds of silence for Thomas Karas to realize the difference between political performance and constitutional reality. 47 seconds is all it took for an entire career, built on proximity and executive fiat, to dissolve under the sterile, fluorescent gaze of the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence. The truth, Karas learned, has no political allegiance. It only has jurisdiction. The hearing room, SC 101, was not designed for comfort. It was engineered for accountability. It was a space of contained tension, where the weight of the American political establishment settled upon the wide, polished mahogany table. The room was cold, the air conditioning whirring slightly above the audible threshold, a subtle white noise meant to mask the quickening pulse of those under scrutiny. Above the dais, the brass seal of the United States Senate gleamed under the directional light, the only overtly dramatic element in a setting otherwise characterized by severe, uncompromising lines. Thomas Tom A. Karas, the Assistant Secretary for Counterintelligence and Surveillance Oversight, sat alone at the witness table. His suit was impeccable, his posture rigid, yet the slight, almost imperceptible tremor in his right hand, hidden just below the table edge, betrayed the immense pressure. Karas had spent his professional life managing classified information and managing up, believing that the protection afforded by executive privilege and opaque security clearances was absolute. Today, however, he was facing Senator Eleanor Vance, a woman whose legal reputation was built on forensic precision and a quiet, almost clinical disdain for political evasion. The committee's focus was officially titled Oversight Review of Budgetary Allocation and Operational Scope in the FY 2026 Counterterrorism Appropriations Act. This bureaucratic mask concealed the true quarry, an off-the-books, digitally integrated domestic surveillance initiative codenamed Project Chimera. This program, allegedly initiated under Karas's direct supervision, had exploited a vague provision intended for overseas threat tracking and repurposed it to monitor a wide swath of domestic political activity and data aggregation on American soil, entirely bypassing the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, FISC, process. Karas's opening statement had been a polished defense of necessary ambiguity, using phrases like proactive threat modeling and dynamic security architecture. He spoke of protecting the nation, but the tone of the room remained skeptical. The 7 senators flanking Vance, a bipartisan assembly of lawyers, former intelligence officers, and policy wonks, viewed Karas not as a patriot, but as a liability. The fluorescent ceiling lights reflected sharply off the polished marble floor and occasionally flashed on the lenses of the photographers at the back, brief, kinetic bursts of energy that highlighted the gravity of the moment. Every pen stroke, every shifting of notes by the Senate aides, sounded unnaturally loud. The political tone was already set. Karas was not here to explain. He was here to justify a constitutional overreach that, if proven, would shatter the fragile trust between the executive and legislative branches. The question was not if Project Chimera was illegal, but how deep Karas's personal culpability went, and whether his legal defense would hold up to Vance's impending, surgical cross-examination. The silence, after Karas finished his prepared remarks and settled back in his chair, stretched into an uncomfortable certainty. But the silence wasn't over yet. The gavel did not fall. Senator Vance simply leaned forward, the movement both slight and immensely heavy. Her voice, calm and measured, cut through the tension with the precision of a scalpel. She did not raise the issue of legality immediately. Instead, she focused on the tedious, administrative bedrock of the operation. This was not a challenge to Karas's patriotism, but to his competence and adherence to procedure. Mr. Karas, Senator Vance began, her voice devoid of inflection. On June 14th of this year, the initial $85 million tranche for Project Chimera was authorized via a transfer from the unallocated Special Operations Contingency Fund. Is that correct? Karas nodded once, firmly. Yes, Senator. That fund is designated for dynamic, high-priority national security imperatives. It was within my delegated authority to initiate that transfer. He tried to meet her gaze, projecting confidence. Delegated authority, yes. But let's examine the source document for that delegation. The FY 2026 Appropriations Act, Section 301, subsection B, states clearly that funds transferred from the Special Operations Contingency Fund must be applied to assets and infrastructure exclusively dedicated to foreign intelligence gathering, as defined by 50 U.S.C. Section 3003(4). Do you recall that statutory requirement, Mr. Karras? The question was a subtle, legal trap. Karras shifted slightly, adjusting his tie, a microgesture of discomfort. I do, Senator. And Project Chimera, at its inception, was precisely that. An augmentation of our overseas threat mapping capabilities. Vance paused, letting the word inception hang in the air. She produced a large, laminated organizational chart, placing it on the desk before him. It detailed the chain of command for Project Chimera. Let's look at the integration points, Mr. Karras. The project was immediately cross-linked with the FBI's domestic counter-extremism unit databases and utilized commercial bulk data providers whose contracts explicitly specify U.S. consumer data streams. Does the collection and analysis of domestic consumer data, even for pattern recognition, fall under the definition of exclusively foreign intelligence gathering as prescribed in the statute I just cited? Karras hesitated for the first time. The silence was louder now, the whir of the air conditioning seeming to slow down. Senator, the data streams are agnostic. We use them to establish baselines. The intent of the collection is to identify foreign threat vectors operating within the United States. We are not targeting U.S. persons. Vance leaned closer, her eyes locked on his. Let's reread the statute, Mr. Karras. It pertains to the infrastructure, not merely the intent. The moment the program ingested domestic data streams, did it not fail the exclusively foreign test, rendering the initial $85 million transfer unauthorized under Section 301(b) of the Appropriations Act? More simply, did you seek a statutory waiver or judicial review from the FISC before linking to domestic databases? Karras swallowed hard. He had expected an argument about privacy. Vance was pressing on illegal budgeting and structural compliance. He attempted to pivot back to his prepared talking points. Senator, we have clear legal opinions internally that this falls under necessary executive interpretation. I am not asking for a legal opinion, Mr. Karras, Vance interrupted, her tone sharpening, yet remaining controlled. I am asking for a simple, factual answer, under oath. Did you secure a waiver or judicial authorization for that structural integration? Yes or no? Karras blinked once. Slowly. The temperature in the room, despite the cold air, seemed to rise slightly. He was cornered on a procedural truth that was impossible to deny without committing perjury. He finally conceded, his voice barely a rasp. No, Senator. We did not. But the silence wasn't over yet. The admission, no, Senator. We did not, was the crack. Senator Vance now moved to widen it, transitioning from budgetary compliance to explicit legal and ethical failure regarding U.S. persons. She adjusted the microphone slightly, a sound that echoed through the room like a small detonation. Thank you for your honesty, Mr. Karras. Let's proceed to the operational scope. On September 3rd, 3 months after that unauthorized transfer, your department issued an internal guidance memo titled Guideline 19B, Mission Creep Assessment. I have the relevant, non-classified summary here. Vance lifted a slim, pale blue folder. This memo was signed by your deputy director, Mr. Elijah Thorne, with your initialed approval on the final page, confirming its contents were read and understood. Do you recognize this document? Karras squinted at the folder, his jaw tightening. This was highly specific, internal documentation he had believed was shielded by executive compartmentalization. I believe I recall the general thrust of the guidance, Senator. It was a standard internal compliance review. It was not standard, sir. It was a categorical warning. Guideline 19B specifically states, and I quote, the current data ingestion models for Project Chimera have begun to show statistically significant overlap, up to 18%, with the communication data of U.S. persons legally engaged in constitutionally protected political advocacy and journalism. This constitutes a substantial risk of violating the FISA Amendments Act Section 702(b) and potentially the Fifth Amendment Due Process Clause. Unquote. My question is direct, Mr. Karas. Upon reading this explicit, internal warning that your program was already collecting constitutionally protected domestic communication, what immediate, corrective legal action did you take to cease that collection? The question was devastating. Karas now understood the true objective of the hearing. They were not focused on budgets, but on the subsequent, deliberate negligence of constitutional protection. He leaned back, attempting to re-establish control, his voice taking on a slightly defensive, bureaucratic tone. Senator, my team reviewed that finding. The 18% figure was a projection, not an established reality. We implemented enhanced minimization procedures, sifting techniques designed to strip U.S. person identifiers from the data pool, before any analysis was conducted. This is an established practice under existing protocols. Vance nodded slowly, her expression unreadable. I understand minimization protocols, Mr. Karas. But Project Chimera was a data-at-rest system, meaning the data was collected and stored before minimization was applied. Your program had, by your deputy's own account, already acquired and stored data pertaining to citizens exercising their First Amendment rights. You were alerted that you had a constitutional violation in a server rack. She paused for emphasis. You chose, based on your own approval of Guideline 19B, to treat a probable violation of the Fourth Amendment, unreasonable search and seizure, as merely an IT problem requiring a software fix. Can you point to any specific, codified administrative regulation or internal DOJ memo that permits the Assistant Secretary to override the clear statutory requirements of the FISA court process based solely on an internal minimization projection? Karas opened his mouth, then closed it. The technical question forced him out of the realm of political interpretation and into the cold clarity of administrative law, where no such regulation existed. He grabbed the water glass, his hand shaking slightly as the cold glass condensation briefly reflected the bright, unblinking television camera lights. He knew the answer was no, but he could not say it. He needed a deflection, a moment to regain his footing. He leaned forward, attempting to turn the procedural debate back into a patriotic one. Senator Vance, with respect, we were operating under conditions of extreme urgency. My priority was the safety of the American people, not the bureaucratic adherence to. Vance cut him off, her tone shifting from forensic to moral, locking him into the impending climax. Your priority, Mr. Karas, according to your oath, must always include the Constitution. The only thing you prioritized was operational expediency over fundamental rights. Your silence, sir, suggests that you knowingly continued a program you knew to be constitutionally compromised. But the silence wasn't over yet. Senator Vance's last statement, the only thing you prioritized was operational expediency over fundamental rights, was the cue. She didn't wait for Karas to frame another political justification. She moved in, swift and surgical, isolating him entirely from his prepared defenses. Vance placed a single, small document on the table, a printout of an unredacted communication intercept from Project Chimera's servers. It detailed a series of email exchanges between an unnamed American journalist and a congressional staffer regarding potential misuse of FEMA funds. The journalist's identity was clearly visible, a U.S. citizen operating under the constitutional protections of the press. Mr. Karas, Vance said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, forcing everyone in the room to lean forward. On October 19th, your team, under your standing orders for threat prioritization, reviewed and subsequently flagged this entire thread for further deep dive correlation. This is a U.S. person, engaging in what is clearly constitutionally protected journalistic inquiry into a matter of public interest. My question is simple, legal, and absolute. Under what specific legal authority, statutory or judicial, did you authorize the review and actionable tagging of a U.S. person's domestic communications data, knowing that your project already lacked the required FISC warrant? Karas knew, intellectually, that this moment was inevitable. But the stark reality of the intercept, laid bare on the mahogany table, was paralyzing. He had relied on the ambiguity of the program's charter, believing the data's sheer volume would protect him. Now, faced with a single, unassailable piece of evidence, his entire argument dissolved. He attempted the only defense left, executive generalization. Senator, this was a rogue entry, an outlier event. It was not representative of the mission. It was a technical misapplication of a broad search filter. I can assure the committee that no harm was done, and the data was subsequently purged. Vance did not react to the lie. She simply delivered the fatal blow, articulating the legal consequence of his evasion. Purging the data, Mr. Karras, does not purge the constitutional violation. The moment your system, lacking a warrant, acquired and accessed that communication, you violated the Fourth Amendment guarantee against unreasonable search and seizure. More importantly, your subsequent action, the deep dive correlation, directly violated the Fifth Amendment's due process clause by effectively imposing a state penalty, surveillance and flagging, without any legal process or judicial oversight. She leaned across the table, her eyes burning into his. You claim technical error. I submit that you substituted executive decree for judicial review. The moment you ordered that data tagged, Mr. Karras, you were no longer operating as an assistant secretary. You were operating as an unauthorized magistrate, illegally issuing a search warrant on a U.S. person without probable cause. Is it not true that your failure to seek any judicial authorization transformed a systemic failure into a deliberate, felony-level violation of due process? The question was a legal supernova. Karras finally lost it. His carefully constructed composure shattered. He stared at the intercept, then at Vance, his eyes darting wildly. A faint sheen of sweat appeared on his forehead. He began to speak, but the words came out as a strained, inarticulate noise, a broken sound of frustration and defeat. 47 seconds. That was the exact time interval recorded by the stenographer between the end of Vance's final question and Karras's physically evident breakdown. He fumbled with the water glass, knocking it over. The water spread silently across the polished wood, staining the edge of the blue folder. He raised a hand, mouth open, his breathing ragged, before physically recoiling from the table, muttering, I was told this was covered. I was told it was covered by, his voice trailed off into a hollow whisper, revealing, in that moment of collapse, his complete ignorance of the specific legal framework under which he operated. He had trusted proximity to power over the letter of the law. The failure was fatal because it exposed, undeniably, that Karras had not just made a mistake in budgeting. He had knowingly operated a program that abrogated the Fifth Amendment due process clause, a fundamental requirement for the legal exercise of government power, based on nothing more than a political assurance that it would be covered. The absolute silence that followed his broken whisper confirmed the collapse. But the silence wasn't over yet. The sound of the toppled water glass hitting the marble base of the dais, followed by Karras's broken, whispered confession, was the final punctuation mark. The room plunged into a profound, televised silence. Within 10 minutes, the entire landscape of Washington, D.C. shifted. On the floor of the Senate hearing room, the committee went into an immediate closed executive session, the cameras cutting to the exterior of the room, a static shot of the elaborate wood doors and the flashing media lights outside. But the damage was done. The legal failure, exposed in 47 seconds, was already a national story. On cable news, the reaction was immediate and seismic. MSNBC anchor, voiceover constitutional scholars called it the most devastating Senate takedown since Watergate. For 4 to 7 seconds, America watched competence collapse, followed by an admission of utter constitutional negligence. Thomas Karras, the Assistant Secretary for Counterintelligence, has, in all likelihood, just ended his career and jeopardized every piece of domestic intelligence gathered under his unauthorized Project Chimera. Legal analyst, Harvard Law, on-screen quote, "This isn't just a political scandal, it's a legal nullification." Karras's statement, "I was told this was covered," was a direct admission that he operated the program without requisite judicial intent and without probable cause. By flagging that journalists protected communication, he provided indisputable evidence of an intentional Fourth Amendment violation. The implications are staggering. Every resulting prosecution, every surveillance action derived from Chimera's data streams, is now poison. We are looking at potentially hundreds of cases collapsing due to what is known as fruit of the poisonous tree doctrine. The institutional consequences materialized instantly. The Attorney General released a terse, two-sentence statement announcing that Karras was placed on immediate, unpaid administrative leave pending a joint review by the Department of Justice, DOJ, and the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, ODNI. This was not a defense. It was a strategically timed separation intended to insulate the larger executive branch from Karras's personal liability. The public reaction was a mix of outrage and profound institutional fatigue. Congressional leaders, already battling over judicial appointments, used the moment to launch a bipartisan, highly critical inquiry into executive overreach. Speaker of the House Randall released a statement condemning the arrogance of unelected officials who treat the Constitution as an inconvenience. The focus shifted from Karras's individual hubris to the systemic failure that allowed Project Chimera to operate for months with an illegal budget allocation, violating the Appropriations Act, and a constitutionally flawed mandate, violating the Fourth and Fifth Amendments. The institutional damage wasn't just to one man's reputation, it was to the operational integrity of the surveillance state. Karras's collapse provided the precise, unassailable legal ammunition needed by civil liberties groups and congressional oversight committees to demand immediate, drastic, and permanent curtailment of executive data collection powers. The entire apparatus of surveillance, built on a delicate balance of secrecy and judicial review, was now structurally compromised by the failure of one man to adhere to the most basic requirement of the rule of law. But the silence wasn't over yet. The institutional wreckage left by the Project Chimera hearing was not loud. It was quiet, deep, and final. It settled into the bureaucratic machinery of Washington like corrosion, unseen but crippling. Thomas Karras, removed from his post, was not subjected to a sensational perp walk. His recompense was delivered through the sterile, unforgiving channels of administrative consequence. He became a case study in the dangers of executive drift, a testament to what happens when political loyalty supplants constitutional literacy. The reflection on the entire incident focused less on Karras's betrayal and more on the structural vulnerabilities he had exploited. Senator Vance, in her final remarks to the committee, articulated the moral closure with calm detachment. The law, she stated, is not a political variable. It is a constant. When officials seek shortcuts around the Fourth Amendment's warrant requirement or the Fifth Amendment's due process clause, they are not making the nation safer. They are actively dismantling the legal framework that defines a secure and free society. The ensuing fallout was methodical. A special master was appointed by the FISC to conduct an exhaustive review of every piece of data harvested by Project Chimera, with the near certainty that the entire dataset would be declared inadmissible and subject to mandatory destruction due to the unconstitutional collection methodology. The estimated cost to the taxpayer for this mandatory nullification, according to a subsequent GAO report, exceeded $120 million in sunk costs, legal fees, and administrative cleanup. Karras's career did not end with a bang of scandal, but with the soft, deliberate thud of official papers being sealed and filed away. He resigned formally 3 days after the hearing. The press conference was brief, held by a department spokesperson, who characterized the entire episode as a regrettable misinterpretation of evolving statutory requirements. But those who watched the 47-second collapse understood the truth. It was not a misinterpretation. It was a fundamental failure to grasp that in the American system of governance, proximity to power does not grant immunity from the Bill of Rights. Karras was a cautionary tale for the next generation of political appointees, a man who confused operational necessity with legal license. He had believed that his department's mission was morally self-justifying, making the details of the law, the specific subsections, the required judicial steps, merely suggestions to be sidestepped in the name of expediency. He had discovered that the Constitution's rigor is its greatest strength, and ignorance of its mandates is the most unforgivable sin in the capital. The system, once violated, does not forgive or forget. It simply cleans up. Some careers end in scandal. His ended in silence. The silence of the hearing room gave way to the quiet, irreversible grinding of the judicial process. Karras's name would fade from the headlines, but the legal precedent set by his failure would remain, a permanent, etched reminder in the history of congressional oversight. Washington doesn't punish ignorance. It replaces it.